Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them, and the conference director. I'm joined as my co-host today is that German legend Philip Tanzer, who loves Germany so much he now lives in the north of Scotland. And welcome,
And
Philip. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I think on Thursday as well, you'll be joining me in 2 days' time. So that's really, really appreciated.
And I've got something very special here. I've got some ICMI memorabilia
from Chicago.
Mark from Chicago.
Very good. Unfortunately, we don't have any for these. We really should do. Anyway, let me introduce our wonderful interviewee today. It's Jan James, who heads up Good Egg Safety, a community interest company, I think it's called. Jan, a very warm welcome. I wonder if you could just say a few words about your company and obviously the particular topic we're talking about today.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting us. You've got a really fantastic timetable, and it's always a privilege to speak up for those who are unable to speak out for themselves. We set up Good Egg Safety back in 2001. Dynamic Group, which is my social marketing agency. And we have since that time been working on child safety campaigns with the UK's leading child seat safety campaigner. We also work in home safety and young driver safety. We moved the Good Egg brand across to its own community interest place in 2016 as a non-profit, because I wanted people to understand that when I'm found ranting, which unfortunately is more often than I wish, it's not for personal enrichment, it's for raising awareness of issues that we all need to care about. We started looking at, actually, I became acquainted with parental alienation about 9 years ago, and watched the decimation of 2 children I'd started to love, and realised about 3 years ago I needed to commit our brand to addressing it. So we've been working with leading experts around the world. If I'm good at anything, it's getting the right brains around the table, and we are campaigning to give a voice to those parents whose children have been effectively abducted from them. But that's why we got in the space. I watched it myself. I know it's real. No one can tell me that parental alienation doesn't exist.
No, indeed. And I'd just like to show people this absolutely astonishing document. It really is. It's I recommend it to people every day, Jan. It is absolutely the gold standard of communicating complex issues. It's a beautiful thing. And I know you've got orders. Somebody's put in an order for 6 copies just on the back of your video just now. So it's wonderful. I recommend everybody buys a copy of this. It's it's just the absolute gold standard as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
Philip, I wonder if you could ask the first of your questions.
Yeah, I would actually like to start with something quite basic. I think everybody knows somebody who has experienced some form of a milder form or a stronger form of parental alienation. So when you explain to people what it is, everybody says, oh yeah, I've seen that in my real life. Yet many politicians, women's organizations are fighting against the recognition of parental alienation. How can something that is so obvious and that on an emotional basis and on a lived experience basis that everybody knows, how can that be rejected? Isn't that a rejection of reality in some ways?
It's a very good question, and you are absolutely right. The behaviours of parental alienation are endemic. Everyone knows someone who has suffered from them or is suffering from them, either a relative, a work colleague, a friend, neighbour. So it is astounding that it isn't central to our government Domestic Abuse Act policy. The issue here, and it's a fascinating and horrifying one in equal measure, is that the issue of parental alienation isn't the main issue at all. I'm a social campaigner. So when we look at doing a campaign, and we run many different campaigns, including on domestic abuse, which is where undoubtedly parental alienation fits. The first thing we have to do is look at all the evidence. We accept nothing on face value, and we do our homework, and I do that well. I'm quite pedantic about my research, and I look at everything and make no assumptions. I knew the parental alienation exists because I'd seen it myself. I'd seen the effects on children, and I knew that I had to speak up and speak out. But I wanted to get the evidence, and I wanted to understand it better. And so what I found is the issue isn't parental alienation. Everyone does know it exists. What we're talking about here is attachment dysfunction. Attachment-based science is very basic and very common, and everybody who knows humans would understand that, you know, human biology, children attached to both parents. That's how they kept safe from predators and didn't get eaten when they were in the caves. What's happened is it's been supplanted by gendered ideology that is positioning the behaviours of parental alienation as a means only for abusive fathers to re-victimise mothers. So it has been repositioned, distorted and amplified, and all we ever see now in the media is that proposition. The fact is, though, it doesn't matter how many times you repeat a falsehood, it remains false. It is a nonsense to suggest that it is only a means for abusive fathers. Yes, of course, some abusive fathers may use that as a tool, but we have equal evidence that women, and indeed men, have raised false allegations of abuse against a safe parent. And the lie in this story is that we work with thousands of alienated mothers too, alienated by the exact same behaviours as fathers have. So this has become a gendered narrative that has no place in a compassionate society. And we're seeing the impact of this in the deaths of little Arthur, when no one is listening to parents and wider family members who are sounding the alarm. Why? Because the women in both those cases were abusers, and no one wants to accept that women can abuse. And that's a very, very dangerous position to be in, particularly for children. That's why we campaign for this.
And what do you think is the reason that the mainstream media narratives in this area, and oh my God, so many areas, domestic violence is a very obvious one. What do you think explains why the mainstream media is, you know, just never reports the truth about issues like parental alienation and domestic violence, for example?
I think that there's a number of reasons. Firstly, you know, if you listen to Erin Pitsey, she is the founder of Refuge. She set up Chiswick Women's Aid in 1971 and has led in her 82 years with her heart and soul. Erin oozes compassion from every pore, and she is my heroine and mentor. Her wisdom and legacy has been defamed and diminished, as I mentioned in my video, because she dared to speak the truth, that out of the first 100 women that came through her door, 62 was violent, if not more so than the men that left behind. And, you know, she has been silenced, where in actual fact, the evidence is there. She's shown it in her own research. And so it's being silenced because it's being conflated with women's rights. Now, I'm a woman. I used to call myself a feminist. I'm an equity feminist. I march behind any banner that proclaims equal opportunity, equal rights, equal pay. I have 2 daughters. They grew up the same way as my son, that they could do anything, be anything. One is a top, you know, head of legal. The other is going to do a psychology degree. They have always been empowered to believe that they are as good as anyone. What we're seeing, though, is that the media, they are, because the issue of domestic abuse has been conflated to say only men are abusers, and we've now seen that in the latest proposals that have come from our own domestic abuse commissioner, that domestic abuse is gendered, which is actually at odds with the UK Statistics Authority, who put out 2 clarion warnings that that is not the case. Is that the media are terrified to put out anything that goes against that. And not least because if you do, you can expect a mauling. I've had personal emails from journalists, because I've called them out and gone, where are the journalists? You know, where is the brave journalists that put their neck on the block like we have? We've had more attacks in the last 2 years, and I've had a lifetime. And I'm a survivor of domestic abuse. I'm a child safety campaigner, and yet I've come under vitriolic attack, defamation, etc. Whatever, I don't care. At the end of the day, child protection supersedes all other considerations, professional or personal expediency. But journalists are saying that many of them work as a consultant. They can't get their editor to accept it. So they work on this, they get attacked, their children might get stalked, they're put under threat, and there's no guarantee it'll run anyway, and they won't get paid. So the media being silent. So we believe that we live in a democratic society and we champion free speech. No, we're not. The truth is being censored. But I said at a recent event for Erin, speed may have lies, but truth has endurance, and truth will come out. I guarantee it. It cannot be hidden for too much longer.
I'm sorry, Philip, just before we come to the next question. I was told not very long ago by a senior Sunday Times journalist, I obviously can't name him, that, I mean, he's been with them, I think, 30 years. And he said that even if he proposed an article sympathetic to men's issue, to men, or challenging feminism or feminists, he would expect to be fired the same day. And we had a few months ago, the Spectator is generally sort of centrist or right of centre. But when it comes to gender politics, they are absolutely unfailingly feminist friendly. So, for example, they've had more than 50 articles by Julie Bindel, a radical feminist who's made a career out of lying about domestic violence. More than 50 articles. We could not even get from the feminist editor of the UK edition agreement for a full page ad with myself and Elizabeth Hobson, just stating what the known facts about domestic violence. And that would have cost £7,000. So we would have had to do a crowdfunder. But the resistance of the mainstream media to being truthful on gender political issues is absolutely, it's overwhelming, and it's global.
What's really interesting is that I think it was in the Spectator, I think the journalist was Isabel Wolfe, who actually captured a comment from the then CEO, Sandra Hawley, of Refuge. And it was along the lines of, if we accept that there's an issue with male, abuse against male victims, it will affect our funding. So this is the issue here. This is the issue that in the March of Female Rights, which obviously I support anything that supports the advancement of women's rights, but there's a difference between advancing women's rights and then having to mean and diminish half our population in order to do that. That's then not forwarding human rights. That moves into privilege, and it's being misused. So I think that really encapsulated what this is an issue about. It's about the misunderstanding of forwarding women's rights, when in actual fact, it goes against women's rights. Let's be really clear about this. When we have women who game the system, and don't tell me they don't, because you only have to look at the figures, domestic abuse has halved in the last decade, right? According to the police and ONS data. It is halved. Yet if you look at the number of non-molestation, ex parte, non-mol orders, in one family court alone, increased by 2,918%. Now, I'm not a mathematician. In fact, I'm rubbish at maths. But even I can see the anomaly there. So what you've got is you've got people who are gaming the system to prevent an equitable parenting plan, who are actually stealing resources from genuine victims. And as a survivor of life-threatening abuse, I'm married at 17, I was almost dead by 18. I want to see every sister survivor protected fully. That renders me incandescent. That is not forwarding women's rights. That is stealing from victims who need it.
Right, but it's giving women more power, Jan, which is why it happens regardless of the consequences. Philip, sorry, can we move on to next question?
Sure. One thing I wanted to say, because Jen, you were talking about truth and lies. I think the thing about lies is that they have to be repeated constantly to keep them alive, where the truth would survive by itself. That's why we constantly hear the same messages and narratives, no matter how insane they are. I would say we see the same thing with the COVID-19 fear-mongering in many ways. I would like to read a message out from one of the attendees, and I would encourage all the people watching now to send in messages that we can ask Jan.
He also has a presentation later in the week, Philip. This is Douglas Wallace.
All right.
And so we'll be interviewing him as well. So just wanted to say that.
Brilliant. So the question is from Douglas, and it's a question that clearly shows that he knows the area as well. Some years ago, we were having a battle to have parental alienation listed in the International Classification of Diseases, ICD. It was either ICD 8 or 9. I think it was. I admit I've dropped the ball personally. Is it still in the ICD? That is his question.
I'm not sure it's the ICD, actually.
It is the ICD.
Oh,
it is the
I'm
ICD.
sorry.
Yeah.
So I know there's an international thing on psychiatry,
Yeah.
isn't there?
Yeah,
Okay.
it is.
Excuse me then.
So in answer to the question, the ICD is run by the World Health Organization, and parental alienation was indeed going to be included in ICD 11 under relational phenomenon, a caregiver relational problem. It was there for quite some time, and at the very last minute, there was the memo of concern issued to them from feminist academics, led by Professor Linda Nielsen, not to be confused with Professor Linda Nielsen, who is an advocate for shared parenting, who's a wonderful woman. And again, the misinformation was given to the ICD, to the World Health Organization, that they keep going back to Gardner. You know, the Gardner was a paedophile, that it's pseudoscience, that it's not backed up by evidence, which is completely wrong. I mean, there should be, you know, some criminal sanctions for anyone that puts out misinformation that damages and hurts children and victims. Gardner was not a paedophile. In fact, he represented men as well as women as well as men. But parental alienation has been identified long before Gardner coined the phrase parental alienation. It goes back to the 1800s. So that's how it was removed. So it's now not in there. But the ICD have other classifications that you could reference that refer to the behaviours of parental alienation. And the best one there is F24, persecutory delusion. Because if you listen to Dr. Craig Childress, and it makes perfect sense if you think about this, children attach to parents to protect themselves from predators. So what an alienating parent does, and that alienating parent could be a mother or a father, because this is not a gendered issue, what they do is they create fear in the mind of that child against the other parent. They're not fit to parent. They take drink and drugs. You know, they don't love you. They've abandoned you. They create this persona, and they create essentially a persecutory delusion in the mind of that child, which then suppresses their attachment system. It is a terrifying thing for a child because their whole security is then eroded. And what people don't understand, even alienators, is if you teach a child that half of who they are is unworthy, is unlovable, is dangerous to them, that is what they imbue themselves. They innately take that on board themselves. So they not only hate, and I use the term loosely because they still love them, but they have to hate them, the parent who has been alienated from the victim parent, but they also begin to hate who they are. And you see that expressed then as they get older with drug and alcohol abuse, promiscuity, trying to find the love that they lost from one of their parents, suicide ideation. One of our children, who we've now interviewed as an adult, had suicide ideation before the age of 10 because she was told her father didn't love her. And she found out 20 years later that he actually did and had tried very hard to be with her. So you're creating a persecutory delusion. And you can see that. You can see it. There are 2 high-profile cases in the media, both of whom have passed the threshold for significant psychological harm to their children. One abducted the children. They had drugs in their system that was a mother's prescription drugs, and now still presents as if she's the victim, supported by an activist, like the court said, who actually house some women who have been found to abuse, because they're trying to convince us that women are not abusers and only victims. And you can see the delusion there. You know, you can see the delusion, and that delusion is then passed on to the children. But people dare not speak out about this, because you speak out about this, you're going to get attacked. Someone has to speak out, because children are precious and need protection.
I agree. Jan, just a couple of points I'd like to make. I've often wondered how many children go to the end of their lives believing that a parent didn't love them. I mean, that is child abuse, and abuse of adults, actually. An abuse, of course, of the alienated parent. I take your point that parental alienation isn't a gendered issue in the sense of either fathers or mothers can do it. Of course, absolutely take that on board. But it's surely a gendered issue in the sense that, you know, given that 92% of parents with custody are mothers, they have the opportunity that the father doesn't. Not that, you know. So surely you know, it's gendered in the sense that most, you know, the overwhelming majority of victims are fathers. Well, and the children, of course, but are fathers.
Yeah. So to answer that question, 93% of residency goes to mothers. So, and parental alienation is undoubtedly a power and control issue. When we say it's not gendered, what we're saying is, if you look at the research from someone that we work with in Nigeria, she looked at parental alienation in the UK and compared it with Nigeria, and it was the opposite. In Nigeria, which is undoubtedly a more patriarchal society, men get custody, and therefore men were more likely to alienate from these poor mothers. So it's not a gendered issue, it's only an issue of residency. Yeah. Right. So we've got to be really clear about that.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's a nuance, but it's an important one. Yes, Very. Yes, Philip.
I've got a question in that regard, and after that, we could ask the question of Uncle Mike, which I guess is not Uncle Mike Buchanan. My question, which fits into what you were just saying, do you think that 50-50 shared custody would reduce or even solve to a large extent parental alienation issues? Is there some research in countries that have 50-50 custody?
I think the answer to your question is undoubtedly, if we had more equitable sharing plans, you would reduce, because it is a power and control issue. If you have, the difficulty for a child is if they are with a resident parent who makes it plain that they hate the other parent, that they don't want them to mention their name in the house, that they really would rather that they didn't go and visit, and they make it quite clear in their, you know, their either their speech or in their body language, but particularly, you know, it's very evident to children who are alienated that the resident parent, whether it's a resident father or resident mother, doesn't want them to have a relationship, and it creates a fear of abandonment. Children's greatest fear is being abandoned. So therefore the power is that the child will automatically acquiesce with the parent that has the power, because otherwise they're terrified they're going to be abandoned by both. So to have a 50-50 would make it far less likely that alienation could happen. I can't say it would stop it altogether, but it would certainly make it less likely. Professor Linda Nielsen, the positive one, found from her research, I think she looked at about 34 peer-reviewed studies, a lot in the sort of Scandinavian countries, and what she found was that children who have at least 35% time with both parents post-separation perform as well on all the key indicators we would wish to see for them, physically, emotionally, neurologically, as children in intact families. Who would not want that for our children? Yep. 35% time is the gold standard.
One of the issues that really stood out for me in your talk, one of many, was that I think a survey in Scotland, hopefully I got that right, that quite a number of children had told the non-custodial parent, usually the father, of course, that they didn't love them, and this was at the behest of the custodial parent, again, usually the mother. It's a dreadful thing.
So that was research. I was invited to present at Holyrood. It was a shared parenting event. It was before lockdown. I think it was 2019. It's easy to lose track of time, really. And at that event, the then Deputy Convener for Equalities and Human Rights, Erin Campbell, approached me and asked whether they could support some research with Scottish Youth Parliament. Well, that was just a golden opportunity, and I was very grateful for that. So, of course, my answer was yes, please. We want as much evidence as possible, because that's what we build our case on, evidence-based. They worked with, because they were only 16 at the time, I was concerned about their age. So we had two child psychologists and a former child psychiatrist, a retired child psychiatrist, just to support them whilst they were doing it. But they worked on the questions, they put it out to the Scottish Youth Parliament, and it was shared. The survey was shared by Young Scot, which is a fantastic organisation that works with young people across Scotland in Child First. They had about 88 responses and sent us the results. And the quote that they gave was, "This is a call to action for all decision makers, because the UNCRC articles are being breached." And what they found was that a quarter of all respondents had to tell another parent that they did not love them in order to keep the other parent happy. So right there is alienation.
The cruelty behind that it's just unfathomable to me. I'd just like to come on, Jan, to Douglas raised the issue of the ICD, and I'm sorry I wasn't aware of the thing, but what I was alluding to, which I thought wrongly Douglas was the DSM, and I believe parental alienation is now in that, but only after after decades of feminist resistance. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yeah, it's not actually, here's the thing, it's not named specifically as parental alienation, but let's be clear about this. Neither is domestic abuse. Nowhere in the ICD or the DSM does it say domestic abuse. What we're looking at here then is the behaviours. So in the DSM-5, and it's 995, it refers to non-accidental injury, where it's basically non-accidental verbal or symbolic acts by a child's parent or caregiver that will result in significant psychological harm. So it's about that repetitive behaviour that gives them the impression that that parent is dangerous, unloving, etc., etc. So that's in the DSM-5. And one of our many thousands of victims, a female actually, an alienated mother, said when I went to court, the court-appointed psychologist actually identified DSM-5 995, and it was thrown out that there was no such thing as parental alienation. So here's the rub. The women's groups that are putting out the parental alienation doesn't exist are hurting women. That's the irony. They are severely hurting women. We're working with thousands of them. A group of them sent a video they did to the House of Lords, and they all held up, how long they'd been alienated for. So women's groups are not supporting women when they deny parental alienation, and nor are they supporting girls who are the children of alienation, as are boys, when they ignore alienation or ignore male victims. The cycle of abuse continues. We need to have a more gender neutral approach to dealing with domestic abuse, of which parental alienation should be included. And we would then hopefully start reversing the 1 in 6 children who have mental health disorders in the UK. Right. Not least 27% of young women aged 17 to 22 have a mental health disorder, according to NHS research, October 21. That's terrifying, because they will soon be mothers. We're going to see many more Archie Spriggs and Little Arthur stories if we don't address this now.
Yes, Jan, as always, I'm knocked out by your grasp of the details. It's always very impressive. And of course, I mean, just returning to what you were just saying, of course, the state's refusal to see mothers as perpetrators of violence results in children being sent back to violent mothers. And we really shouldn't be surprised that the majority of children who are killed by their mothers, not by their fathers.
And that's terrifying, because this is not a women's rights issue, really, and it's not a father's rights issue. It's a child protection issue,
Yes.
which is why we've got involved. I've spent a lifetime trying to keep kids safe in cars and home when they're driving. And I cannot comprehend why it's such a big battle to get across this child protection issue. It's like everyone has closed ranks and they are, you know, societally gender blind. And that's terrifying.
Well, I think we can lay that very clearly at the door of feminists. Yes, Philip.
I have to ask some questions from our attendees that are patiently waiting. I'm gonna ask one from the app Hoover. It's from Steve Moxon, who is speaking later today. His question or statement is, if the "it's non-gendered" line faces total obstruction, then isn't it time to go full jugular for the feminist lie causing the logjam? 6 of one and half a dozen of the other just leaves them free to pursue feminist focus. As with all manifestations of identity politics, nothing works, and the whole shebang is going to have to be taken out completely. So full-on confrontation is the only way. What is your view on that, Jen?
Right, so I repeat again, I am obviously female. I am an equity feminist. I believe passionately in women's rights. It was only in the 30s that we weren't, you know, we had to fight to get a vote. And at that time, there was a quote from a man to say, "Votes for women and children indeed will be asked to give votes to our horses and dogs next." So let's be really clear, we did come from a very patriarchal society, and I, for one, champion the fact that we are now able to create our own agency. I am also a survivor of life-threatening abuse. I am not a victim. I've never described myself as a victim, nor would I. And I got a beautiful child from that relationship. So I wouldn't want to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater. I believe that there are many good policies that are there to protect women and girls, but I also believe that it is imperative we start protecting men and boys, because otherwise the children of the almost 800,000 male victims of domestic abuse are rendered unprotected, and those who experience domestic abuse are themselves more likely to grow up either as victims or worse, as perpetrators. The current policy is creating more victims and more perpetrators. So my answer is this: if the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs, wishes to take, as she clearly does, a gendered approach, then really we should rename her position Domestic Abuse Commissioner for Women, of which I'm sure she'd be very good. She spent 8 years at Refuge, so I understand she's probably quite biased, yeah? And I'd like to see a minister or domestic abuse commissioner for men and boys, because unless we get parity, we are going to see worsening, you know, issues, and we all pay. We might think, well, you know, this doesn't affect me, you know, my life is good, I'm okay, I'm not going to stick my head above the parapet, but society pays when we see increases in mental health issues. We're seeing rising knife crime, rising drug and alcohol abuse. Jackie Sabaya, right, the head of the serious crime investigation at the police, right, Jackie Sabaya said, unless we address the issue of fatherlessness, this will continue. Yeah. Now, that also didn't go down too well with those who are, I would call Marxist feminists, those who want to dismantle capitalism and society, because it's certainly not a typical feminist view to demean and diminish men. Certainly not my understanding. It's a more extreme form of feminism that is now infiltrated in lots of areas of power and media. So we can't ignore that. You know, we have the police telling us that this is an issue of fatherless society. So we need to address it, and we need people in place who are gender neutral. They need to be tested for their gender bias before they even get this position. They need to be tested so that we get people who are gender neutral, who are not traumatized, who are healthy individuals who can see balance. Until we get balance back into society, we are going to continue to march towards the abyss.
Jen, I know you're working incredibly hard because I'm always in your email loop and I see how hard you work. So at the moment, I would not bother you with it. But once you've done your job and parental alienation is recognized, then I would challenge you to watch some videos about early feminism, because there has been this Marxist negative approach has poisoned the fight for equality from the early beginnings, because there were always some angry and evil people in every movement, I would say,
Of course.
unfortunately.
There always will be.
Yeah, I'm going to do a little shameless plug. You mentioned political representation of men and boys, and I just wanted to hold this up. Minister for Men. So we're campaigning for a Minister for Men, because I do think that without a Minister for Men, in addition to the Minister for Women and Equalities, there will never be consistent representation in and not only in one area, but in all areas that affect men and boys. Now, I would like to read out 2 more or 3 more questions, if we have the time. Yeah, I think we do. One is America specific, so you might not know the answer to that, but maybe you can point that person in the right direction to your contacts from America, which I'm sure you do have. The question comes from Uncle Mike, and it is, what can a grandparent do to see their grandchildren in the US?
Oh, it's so sad, isn't it? Because that's the typical issues of parental alienation, is it doesn't just affect the victim parent, it affects the whole half of the family tree, and those children lose their familial ties that are actually a protective, a vital protective layer additional that governments can't give to children. It's family, so critical. I don't know the law in America. Certainly here at the moment, grandparents can spend a lot of money going to court, but there isn't an automatic right for grandparents to continue seeing them. What I'll do is I'll find out, because we work with Jennifer J. Harmon and many other brilliant researchers in America. So if you email me that question, I will forward it and see if I can get a full response, and I'll send it back to you to pass on, if that's okay. I'd hate to give the wrong information on that.
Is there a way for Uncle Mike to contact you directly, maybe through your organization?
Yeah, my email is Jan, Jan, at gooteggsafety.com.
Okay, brilliant.
And I'll forward it on for him. Because in America as well, you've got different laws in different states. So it isn't just, here's the American view. Some states, recognize shared parenting, and some parents don't. Some states don't. So it depends what state he's in. So if he lets me know, sends me the question, lets me know which state, and I'll forward it on.
Thank you. Yes, last night, a speaker with the name X-Man, he talked briefly about the National Coalition for Men, which I think is predominantly based in Chicago. So Uncle Mike, maybe you want to get in touch with them as well. And maybe they know something about the laws in America. Okay, and the next question comes from Hoover again, and just a second. It's been asked by another panelist, Hannah. The question is definition of parental alienation an issue when it comes to policymakers? I think that's a very good question.
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and it certainly is. The Kafka's definition is where the resistance of a child it isn't justified, essentially, but it doesn't come anywhere close to talking about what parental alienation actually is, which is attachment suppression, attachment dysfunction. It's a pathological, aberrant parenting behavior that's designed to sever the close attachment bond that was previously there. So it's a working title at the moment, and it's kind of really all we've got. But I do think that we need more money that we can put into research. Mike has very kindly talked about, our report here, the first thing we did when we stepped onto this societal landmine was get Greater Brains in Mind to sit round our table, led by Erin Pitsey, who, as I say, is my heroine. And we we had barristers and child psychologists, family systems therapists, etc. And we devised a survey with an independent researcher that we put out on our fairly innocuous child seat safety site. So that was among general parents who were looking for seats. It wasn't initially in sort of the hidden alienation sites. And we were inundated. And what was surprising was how many women are also alienated. Because here's the thing, abusers abuse. So actually, rather than men playing the alienation card, an abuser is more likely to alienate rather than actually play the alienation card. So it was quite horrifying. We have an infographic, which is actually in the report. And what we found, we had 2,000 responses, 1,500 from the UK. Almost half of the survey had not seen their children for more than 6 months. And I think, politicians need to ask themselves the question, if I were to drop my kids off at school and then I'm never to see them again for years or months, how would I feel about that? What would I then do? Because that's what it is. It's effectively abduction in plain sight. So yes,
can I ask you, because maybe people want to order your magazine or information pamphlet. Who would you personally? Who would you give it to? Would you give it to psychologists? Would you give it to politicians? So maybe people are thinking about, oh, I could order quite a few of them and hand them out to people. Where do you think it would have the biggest effect in your local area?
Well, I definitely think the politicians need it. I mean, we worked on this unfunded. I took a 20-odd grand overdraft to develop the website, to develop the report, and also, I'm quite proud of this. We do different guides for, we've got about 7 publications for child seat safety and young driver safety and rider safety. They're usually between 28 and 32 pages long. It took us a year to write this. It is our Parental Alienation Survival Guide, and it's got everything in it. Everything that I know. So if someone wants to ring me, usually I'd spend hours on the phone with them, and I can't do my work and speak much as I would like to thousands of followers. So we put everything in here, and this gives them all the information. It'd be really good to send this to your local MP. It's difficult for us to, because we're not in their area. I've spoken to our local MP, and he's horrified and said he will take it forward. But if everyone were to get the survival guide and the study and send it to their local MP, we can start raising visibility of this. Because you'll note in the House of Lords, where the wonderful Baroness Mayer spoke from her heart, because she was alienated from her children for years. She spoke from the heart. She was ostracized at the very beginning, but at the end, she withdrew the amendment, then raised it again. You'll see a lot of really good people then following her. Claire Fox, who said she did her homework then and realized what the evidence was. Baron Winston, Robert Winston, leader in human development, medicine and science, supported her. Many, many more supported her at the end of it. So what this is about education. So those two are critical.
Brilliant. I would like to ask, because you just mentioned the Baroness and how she talked, and most people will probably not be aware of that. That was in regards to the debate on the brand new domestic abuse bill. Now it's a domestic abuse act, and you've been campaigning and fighting very, very hard for the inclusion of parental alienation. Now there have been there have been wins and there have been some setbacks. If I'm correct, at the moment the term alienating behaviors is included in the guidance. Am I correct? And what is your feeling about it? Because the guidance is still in the works. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so Baroness Mayer, as I say, was alienated. So she raised it to include parental alienation and the behaviours within the main Domestic Abuse Act 2021, there was a fierce backlash, and it was ultimately withdrawn. And astonishingly, some of our own victims commissioners, Claire Waxman, wrote to the House of Lords and gave them misinformation about what parental alienation is, which was quite horrifying. And so they withdrew it. And she, Baroness May, then raised it again, and it had to be withdrawn a second time, but it is still within guidance as we know it at the moment. I have a horrible feeling that will also be removed from the guidance notes. Women's Aid have been campaigning to remove alienating behaviours. And here's the paradox, and let's be really clear about this. So Women's Aid hired Dr. Adrienne Bonnet, who is an extreme feminist academic. She's not a medical doctor, but she has extreme feminist views. I have an excerpt of her speaking at a Bahrain conference where she talks about different types of research. She talks about positivism research, which is evidence-based and value-free, but that is not desirable nor possible because we all bring our own bias to our research and what we choose to research and the people we select and how we evaluate it. So she's telling us in our own words that she is choosing and cherry-picking research. That was subsequently found by William Collins when he did his review. She researched, or she produced research from 40 cases over 20 years, so 2 cases a year, to suggest that women are losing children to abusive fathers. And this is the start of the embedding a narrative that actually has no truth. And it's really important that we stand up for that.
That is also connected to the so-called harms report, if I'm not mistaken, that is being used to strip away even more fathers' rights or even more rights of parents that are not custodial parents. And I think our colleague Terry White is talking about that in a couple of hours, and I would urge everybody to not miss his talk. Could I ask, because you mentioned that the fight back from organizations like Women's Aid, for example, what are the structures in government, what are the political structures that are fighting against you and fighting against the recognition of both male victims and the children of male victims? What is I like to call them the feminist cabal in the government.
Yeah.
What are the structures?
I don't call them a feminist cabal because, remember, I am a feminist if it means equal pay, equal opportunities and equal rights. So I think it's really important that we don't allow them to pivot us into, looking like we're against women's rights whilst we're trying to attain, because that's what they do. They are giving the impression that to recognise men's rights would take something away from. So what we've got is this divisive policy, whereas we don't need to take anything away from anyone to protect all victims. I want to see victims, female victims of domestic abuse protected. It is not something I'd wish on my worst enemy. I lived it for 1.5 years and it almost killed me. So I understand better than most who opine on this issue the imperative of protecting genuine victims of parental alienation and domestic abuse. The problem that we have, and going back to the harm report was given to Dr. Adrienne Bonnet without any tender, without any evidence that it would be there would be no bias. There's something that you have to sign, to show that you are sort of autonomous. And the MOJ has subsequently distanced itself from that report, according to our Freedom of Information requests, that actually they had.
MOJ is the Ministry of Justice. For those who don't know. Yeah.
Has disassociated. So although they've used the insignia of the MOJ was not involved in it. And that's really important to highlight. the harm report is aptly named because it's causing incredible harm. One of the key issues there is they're trying to get the presumption of contact to be addressed. They're saying we have a presumption of contact culture. We don't. We have a presumption of contact law. There is a huge difference. And that is, if you look at the UNCRC rights of children, Article 3, Article 7, Article 9, Article 13, they have the right to family life. So that is what we protect. Clearly, if a parent has been abusive, whether they are male or female, then it is right to protect that child. Of course it is. But again, we're conflating domestic abuse, which is also, almost non-gendered, according to PASC, 58% is bidirectional, with moving forward women's rights. And so the harm report, I believe, has done incredible harm, and we need to have a look at that now. I believe that some believe that we'll get a judicial review on that, and that needs to come sooner rather than later.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We only have 2 minutes left. Could you just in 1 minute, because that was my original question, what are the structures that prevent you, for example, from succeeding? You already mentioned the domestic abuse commissioner. Are there other people that are actively working against you?
There are. I think it's particularly the court said, Natalie Page, the founder, was at the Domestic Abuse Commissioners Round Table. And of course, that's the prerogative of the DAC to have anyone there. But what's terrifying is that at a court said event in 2019 in Parliament Square, you had 2 speakers who've been found to have exceeded the significant harm threshold for child abuse. Right. Mm-hmm. So, and it's there, it's available for everyone to see, and indeed was part of the sequence that was shown on Channel 4 dispatches. So had they kept the camera running, that has seen 2 people, one of whom was convicted for 3 years, right, for child abuse, speaking at their event. What are we trying to do here? We need to protect children, and we cannot do that when they are leading the way on seemingly a women's rights issue, when it means putting out false information that affects not only male victims, but also female victims. Because again, as I say, we work with thousands of alienated mothers, and they have been called trolls. They have been re-victimized. And one other thing to be aware of is in the Channel 4 program, 2 of the victims that were represented were misrepresented. They were actually victims of extreme parental alienation. Natalie Page knew that and still allowed them to be re-victimized. So where is the agenda here? Is it protect women? Is it protect children? Or is it to forward a partisan view that affects and impacts everyone?
Philip and Jan, we still got, I mean, normally we have a strict limit that we end at 5 minutes to the hour, but this is so fascinating, Philip. I'd love you to ask just one more question, and then I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Okay, it's going to be a gut punch question, and I'm interested how you're going to answer it. What is your view on women's aid?
Okay, so I am a supporter of any aid that helps protect survivors. I repeat, I am a survivor. So I worked with Women's Aid when I ran a campaign on domestic abuse about 20 years ago in Scotland, and they were wonderful. They recognised male abuse, but that particular campaign was targeting women. And I understand from a marketing perspective that you generally have one message to women and a separate one to men. You wouldn't confuse the two. So I found them wonderful. I don't know what happened in that interim period where we now have Women's Aid working directly against women victims and children. So I'm very concerned about that. They have taken on a very extreme view that wasn't evident when I worked with them in Scotland 20 years ago. And I believe that I'm now finding myself asking for Farah Nazir, the CEO, to quantify her evidence that parental alienation is only a tool for abusive fathers, because we have over 1,000 peer-reviewed articles and books and evidence. Parental alienation is very well evidenced. So where is their evidence? and no response.
And the same,
We need to ask the question.
Yeah. And I might say the same would be true if you ask them for their evidence of one of their mantras, that the overwhelming majority of perpetrators of domestic violence are men and victims women. There is no evidence, but they get away with it because the mainstream media doesn't hold them to account.
I think it's actually been taken from the number of people who ring their helpline. So the majority of people who ring the Women's Aid helpline are women. So therefore it's a gendered crime. I suspect that's where it comes from.
There is something very similar from the organization Save Lives, which have been used to inform the male victims position statement, for example, of the violence against women and girls strategy. And they said the majority of victims are female, and the number was taken by the people that call them, which is 95% women.
Yeah. Philip, thank you for making that point. I need to wrap up very quickly. Jan, thank you for your brilliant answers to so many questions. For anyone who doesn't know, I shall be relaunching my political party as a pro-family and a pro-children's party next year, probably February or March, for reasons I explain at length in my conference video, which was the first video in the conference. And I'd just like to say, we had a very brief chat, Jan, a little while ago about the possibility that you might support us. And, you know, we really could do with the sort of outstanding communication skills that go into reports like that. So if you could support us, Jan, that would be absolutely extraordinary. And I look forward to working with you. I'm sure that'll be very, very enjoyable. And with that, I'm afraid I need to bring this to a halt. Otherwise, we'll have a problem with launching the next video, which starts in 2 minutes. And I just say to everybody, if they want to ask any questions in an hour's time on after the next one, then please do it through Zoom rather than the Hoover link. Jan, thank you very much indeed. And Philip, thank you for being such an excellent co-host.
My pleasure. Jen, as always, a pleasure. Thank you so much for your great work.
Yeah.
Pleasure. Thank you.